Okay, so this is chapter four, where we're going to be talking about application program security. So the whole idea of application development and the security associated with it. There's a couple of things we're looking to do here. So some of the stuff is going to be, you know, how do you embed security into an application? What are the types of things you would need to do around that? And then, how do you protect data? So there's a couple things we're looking at here. Number one is this idea of verifying authentication of user credentials, and also, the management of those permissions, basically what we call, authorization and authentication. In addition, we also are looking at things like, for example, secure encryption to keep data safe from tampering and also from unauthorized access. So the idea is that you're looking at protecting data, and you protect data both as it's being stored and as it's being moved from place to place. All right. And then finally, what you want to do is we want to make sure we're auditing this stuff so we can verify that as things are occurring, where things are not occurring, we're able to track it and go back and verify and validate. So a couple of things we've seen, a couple of things as we've studied this over the years. Um, you know, a couple of things that when you're creating applications that they come into play. Number one is the idea of uh, diversity or the sharing of resources. Basically the development of software is a collaborative effort. It used to be it was one person would be responsible for everything within development. Now it's made up of teams of people, some of which work for your organization, some of which do not, some of which are located in at different locations around the planet. So it's a much more complicated um, environment with different sources of code and testing procedures and stuff not. In addition to that, there's the complexity of the applications themselves, the complexity of the information systems. So as most modern applications have a network element to them. So the whole idea of a networking capability opens up a whole new series of things to be worried about in terms of from a security perspective. So things like procedure calls and database access and web servers and things of that nature. So, you know, the variety, the complexity of all these different elements all kind of come together. And then finally, the factors we see is basically, there are poor development techniques, uh, that contribute to security, in association with that also, uh, very uh, not well defined or not well defined uh, program testing. So the idea is, one of the things we want to test, not just simply the functional requirements of what the application is supposed to do, but also what are the different security aspects. To the degree that's not focused on is to also the degree we end up having vulnerability or security issues in applications. Um, Open source development. So the modern development world, uh, it used to be, that applications were developed, uh, or the software that was developed use those were proprietary platforms. So you bought it from a company, and you deployed stuff that was developed, and you bought it from a company and was deployed uh, to run an application. Now what we see is this idea of open source platforms. So large chunks of the internet, or we see a social network platforms and Google and things and systems like that are all written using components that are open source components, like Linux as an operating system, or open source databases, or basically a whole variety of um, tools and capabilities, development capabilities are all open source. Uh, the idea is now with the advantages of this, supposedly, is that with if you're using open source uh, code, open source tools, different people have a chance to look at it, and so it's an open. Um, it's not a proprietary platform, so people can have the ability to look at it and identify and remediate software bugs. All right, so um, chan which is good at one level. All right, however, you can also have the possibility some people may look to exploit the weaknesses that that are uncovered, or the issues that are uncovered. So that's a risk around that. So you need to understand, kind of a double-edged sword of the open source development. Not so much that you can't use it, but also understand that there's constraints around it, there's limitations around it. Um, understanding what when's the development of software rather than just simply accepting that somebody else is looking for it, or making the assumption that it is secure. So there's a whole uh, and once again, this gets covered through the idea of having your own internal testing and verification processes. You know, part of which is monitoring what's happening on the open source side, plus also applying your own standards and practices around security. So high level languages, the idea of there's when you're developing applications, part of what you can do to verify this stuff, to help verify this stuff, is actually run things in a sandbox. So you actually run it in an isolated system, uh, looking at behaviors, looking at how things, operating, and looking to see if there's anything that would be of concern around that. Um, things that kind of contribute to this, that contribute to security weaknesses are that, the security in and of itself has a tendency to get in the way of people trying to get work done. That's one of the major complaints you'll hear about people. It slows things up. So, a lot of times what you'll see is sometimes, you know, people, users will, instead of using the security options that are out there, will actually turn them off. All right. So, one of the things is, making sure that you can implement it in such a way so you do not take away from the usability of it, and that you have options that you could, activate different functions and not interfere with the end-to-end functionality of the application. Another thing we've seen, especially with higher level languages, is with memory, vulnerabilities of what uh, some people have exploited, or some exploits have taken advantage of the fact that what will happen is a program will write things into memory, um, but it will not necessarily clean up after itself. All right, so what will happen is it'll write things to, like, things like buffers and pool and caches and things like that, and it won't go back, and it will not reset that. So what will happen is, and there's nothing magic about this. If you write something into a memory area, it will stay there until such time as you either write something else to it or you erase it. All right. So attacks that have been leveraged is, when if you can compromise a machine, would be to actually scan, dump, uh, periodically dump memory, and then they go back and kind of mine into it and see what information might be out there. I mean, data that's in memory is, it's just simply a bit pattern that can be captured. So, so it's another issue we run into with this idea of high level languages. These are some of the common things. These are well known vulnerabilities. Something we call buffer overflow. Um, the idea is, and the way this gets invoked is that um, people will write an application and they won't check the length of the field. So what will happen is, if what an attacker will do is they will actually flood a field with a really long, like a couple hundred characters into a field. And what will happen is the program will try to read it. It'll try to move those 100 characters into its, into the system, which will actually create a buffer, what they call an overflow condition. So basically, it will write all that stuff into a overwrite memory, overwrite different sections of the internals of the system, which it can then be used to exploit the system. All right, so it's interesting how complicated, how sophisticated a lot of this stuff has become. If you can get hold, if you can compromise using an overflow, a buffer overflow, you can actually then inject code. Part of what that long string could be is actually chunks of code. And if you can get into like the program counter, which basically controls the next execution of a statement, you can redirect the program and have it run all of your own stuff. Um, another thing, there's a couple other ones out here, a couple variants of it, but another one is what we call like the return to libc attack, which is really a Linux um, it's a variant specifically focused on Linux operating systems. So the idea is what you do is you overflow, you inject an overflow, a long string of characters, which is also executable, also happens to be executable code, which will then let you seize control of the machine. So the idea is a couple different ways to deal with this from an application side is make sure you verify the data as it comes in. From an operating system side, making sure that conditions like that are detected and then basically shut down. So the idea is that to be able to detect that some sort of vulnerability or some sort of buffer overflow has been attacked, has been implemented, and then be able to either alert or disable the system to prevent the attack from succeeding. Format string. There's a couple other ones we've seen here. Format string vulnerability. So another variant, kind of a variant of that. The idea is you can run, basically using a string, which will then let you, if you're running something in privilege, if you're running a program at some sort of privilege level, if you can interrupt that program, you can basically hijack it. So you can do things like crash the program, or basically get it to load rogue instructions or load code into memory. So you can, the idea is you can monitor, if you can modify the internal variables of a privileged program, you've now seized control of the program. And there's a couple other ones out here. This other one we point out here, this race condition vulnerability. Multiple processes. Especially if you multitask or you create threads of activity. The idea is you can basically set things up so in such a fashion so multiple processes are running for the same data concurrently. You can use that as a means of being able to engage a privileged program and then be able to gain control of the system execution. So there's a number of different things. And these are well known and documented conditions. However, they're also, even though they're well known and they're well documented, they also are still effective. So there's a couple other things that we've seen over the years, especially when we introduced the web and mobility into the mix. One of the big attack. This is about maybe we saw this probably early on. As we started moving the web from being a basically just simply a document retrieval system to an interactive system. There's a lot of different technologies that kind of got brought into bear. So Microsoft created something called ActiveX controls. Where you could interject it into a website and it would do things within the website, kind of execute. It would execute code. Applets are a similar thing, basically Java. So in effect, what would happen would be you'd be running a web page, and then you would download, a Java program applet of some size, and then execute things locally. All right. So part of the stuff, ActiveX was a pretty big target for a while because it was not as secure as it needed to be. So you could actually, security was implemented using digital signatures, but you could also develop ActiveX controls without digital signatures, which would be a source of problem. So covert channels is another problem or challenge. Basically, and this is more of a network, kind of a network uh, based uh, approach, where basically what you're the ability to use functions within the system to transmit communications and communicate information in ways that violates system security policy. So, we have what we call a storage channel. So it's a covert channel. One process reading to a storage location, another process reading from it, and a timing channel where resources are interrupted as communication by a second process. So you've got a couple different ways of being able to deal with this. DCOM, distributed component, which is also it's been around a while. The idea is that you would have distributed computing. So if you have distributed computing, it opens up new possibilities of being able to compromise user authentication, um, and rights access to be able to intercept and then kind of hijack things. So the idea is the focus is with this stuff with DCOM is making sure you've got proper authentication, and then for authorization, excuse me, for authentication, and then the proper rights access for authorization. So that it maintains the three levels: the authentication, the integrity, the confidentiality of the data. Because if you do not maintain that on a consistent basis, that vulnerability can be identified and exploited. So malicious code takes all sorts of forms. So the better known ones we know, viruses, which is basically redefined as an unwanted or unsolicited program that's designed to damage a computer system. A couple other ones, well known, spyware, which is basically something that gets interjected onto a machine and will quietly sit there and capture keystrokes and communications internally, and then basically use that information to send that information out, which then could be exploited downstream. Very effective, very commonly used. Ransomware has been around. I think it's got a lot of publicity the past couple of years, where somebody will um, use encryption, basically encrypt somebody's hard drive, and then communicate with them, send them an email and say, okay, well, your hard drive is locked. Send me $50, or on PayPal, and I'll send you the key to unlock it. All right. So so this is kind of a well-known. These are all pretty well-known malicious malicious code techniques. So viruses, see a couple different ways. Viruses have been around a long time. They've been probably one of the mature forms of malware. Early ones showed up with kind of with the first generation of PCs with DOS, who would basically do things like infect boot. They say boot sector, um, well, which is basically how a PC will boot up. When you boot up infect the boot sector, and then attack that, and then the idea is, and then being able to basically adapt itself, being able to attach itself to forms. Viruses take all sorts of different techniques. Um, they call multi-partite viruses. Basically, will go after both the boot sector and also executable files, kind of connect them to a file and piggyback onto it. Script viruses showed up about, I guess, about like maybe 15, 20 years ago. And basically what it would piggyback on scripting languages that would be like, for example, inside of Microsoft Word, you have Visual Basic had a programming capability that was built into Word, which was also not particularly well secured. So that became you could send somebody a Word document, they would open it up, it would invoke a script, and behind the scenes, and be off to the races. So scripts have been around a while. Encrypted viruses. You've seen, this is some newer stuff, where basically what happens is somebody will take a virus and encrypt the virus, and then look to infect the machine, and then once it's onto a machine, it will then execute, decrypt itself, and then go about its business, doing whatever it's whatever damages it seeks to do. So we talked about macro viruses, so script viruses, macro viruses of kind of a similar fashion. Polymorphic viruses is really is kind of our new um, the new form in which basically you've got really smartware, smart viruses that adapt themselves, and so it kind of it's takes on a lot of characteristics of viruses and in real life, where it'll go in and it'll then it'll survive, it'll thrive, it'll attack, it will adapt itself to different circumstances as times go around. So it's a different, a lot of sophistication going out there with it, and then they call companion virus, which is just another, they call it, AKA spawning virus. Uh, the idea is that it kind of sneaks a file into a file system, which will then replace or kind of a be executed in lieu of the real file, the real open file, which will then have some sort of compromising code embedded within it. So virus countermeasures, the longest, probably the most noteworthy, been around the longest while, this idea of using a antivirus software, which is based on like a signature, basically looking for a particular pattern, like for example, a particular file would have a particular length, which might indicate that it would be, characteristically either the length of the file or the date or something of that nature, which would potentially identify it, could be used as picked up in a signature. Um, as viruses have gotten more sophisticated, what we're seeing is the way you are detecting them now is actually using intrusion detection. You monitor activity, you watch what things do, and that becomes the basis for which um, you make decisions around, whether something is as an aberrant behavior. Um, and I like this last one, the idea of avoid opening identified email attachments. A lot of work is going into spam, identifying spam, because spam is really one of the key attack vectors that people use to try to distribute virus these days. But what's happening is, though, it's not just simply spam anymore. It's now we call targeted messaging. So phishing and spear phishing. So spear phishing has gotten very sophisticated, where you will get a message that looks like it came from your mother. Um, with the idea of here, open a file, and that file becomes the mechanism to contaminate a machine. So some other forms, there's a whole bunch of different things. Botnets, large, sophisticated networks of compromised machines of different types. So these can be computers, they can be Internet of Things. Anything that's got a processor could theoretically be a part of a botnet. It takes on different forms, but the idea is having large, you know, you know, you know, multiple thousands of machines basically working together, behind the scenes to, to serve, whatever purpose, person controlling them would want to have the ability to do. Being able to do things like, um, coordination through like command and control channels, peer-to-peer networking, kind of using different well-known managed techniques to gain and sustain access to machines. Denial of service, um, very well known, basically, type of attack basically uses, botnets to basically flood network traffic to particular targets to basically incapacitate them. All right. Logic bomb, you know, you logic bomb is something you gets installed on a machine, will sit there for extended periods of time, and basically then be activated through some set of circumstances. You could put a logic, somebody have a logic bomb on a machine, and somebody could send them a message saying, okay, we please send $500 to this address by this time, or your machine will blow up. You know, a lot of different things, a lot of different variants of that we see out there. Malvertisements. The idea is free software. Which may be free software, but it's also could also be contaminated software as well. Trojan horses. The idea of something embedded in a program that once it gets in, it will establish things like trapdoors, and which gives an attacker ongoing, sustained access to a machine. Worms, basically spreading automatically, taking control of machines. Um, you know, a lot of variants around these types of malware. So the way you deal with this stuff is really through establishing security protocols around this stuff. So patching, ongoing patching becomes basically an ongoing activity, part and parcel of every computer operation. Um, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. When you set up a web server, verification, so things around authentication of non-public sites, through intranet implementations. So running basically designing your network to run through firewalls, so you have opportunities to kind of monitor and track traffic. Using secure socket layer, or what we call now the modern approach, transport layer service, which will encrypt traffic as it moves from point to point. Uh, Developing programs to review the web server logging, because there's a lot of information that's captured in that, but sometimes it's really hard to sit there and read all that stuff. So the idea is a lot of this stuff has now been automated, where you capture all of your web logs, you drop it into some sort of database or some sort of storage, and then you use that you go back and will kind of data mine, looking for attacks, and looking for different kinds of things like unusual URLs, and kind of basically evidence of people or were attempting to use some sort of different types of techniques, or against web servers. And there's a lot of it goes on, because a lot of the stuff is just basically designed to be, a lot of the stuff is automated, and people who have written programs that will search the internet, find machines, identify what type of machine it is, and then apply a variety of different attack methods to see if there are vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Um, Additional things, email, patching around email, FTP, domain name services. These are all well-known um, software platforms, that have pretty well, they're very useful. A lot of people have them. Everybody knows about them. Everybody knows about the vulnerabilities, well-known vulnerabilities within them. So the idea of being able to understand that stuff and try to protect these things, making sure that things are configured properly, make sure they have the right level of patches involved. So patch management, as I said, it's a full-time, it's a really kind of a full-time process involving a chunk of the organization as part of the security organization, to ensure that you know patches are identified, acquired, installed, um, and verified for everything that can be patched in an organization. So you think about how many systems you have, um, how many servers, how many components in your network. All of those things potentially need to be patched. And the purpose of patches is really to correct security and functionality problems, um, well-known problems. So the idea is we do this on an ongoing basis, because these things are discovered on an ongoing basis. So the idea is the more you can stay up to date with your patches, the less vulnerable you are to different types of attacks. And the converse is true. The less you do patching, the more vulnerable you are over time. So as time goes on, the security of an operation will degrade, primarily because if you're not applying patches. Zero day is a pretty well-known concept. The idea is that what will happen is software vendors are always looking for their vulnerabilities. They'll identify their vulnerabilities. They'll fix their vulnerabilities before they announce what those vulnerabilities are. A zero day is a vulnerability in software that's unknown to the vendor. So, zero day attack is a situation where somebody will discover a something that can be exploited and will exploit it before it can be corrected. All right, so 0 day vulnerabilities are not good. The idea is you always kind of you want to minimize. Your work is always the goal and objective of organizations is to minimize your 0 day vulnerabilities, and from that, just some best practices around patches, inventory, understanding. And a lot of stuff is just very methodical, methodical operational stuff. Understand what you got, understand, move to standardize everything, you know, define all your controls, check for things on an ongoing basis, identify where ongoing vulnerabilities are on an ongoing basis, and then also put together a process for how you can, patch, all your policies and strategies around maintaining the appropriate level. One of the challenges a lot of people, organizations run into, sometimes you apply patches, and the patches will quote unquote break something, all right, because it others other things. So creating a process by which you can verify and test um, things in a sandbox or a testing environment before it moves into production is a best practice. So there's a lot of things that as you can see, there's a lot of work goes into this, a lot of kind of ongoing, continuous modifications and verifications of situations. Software forensics, the ability to go back, um, be able to identify uh, things that are in systems, be able to find bad code before it goes in, be able to react and respond to to an attack when something is to come in. So these are all kind of different elements of this. We call it the software forensics, and this is really a list of the different kinds of application security best practices. So this is all the different things organizations would want to put into your application side of things. So around putting and things you want to verify and test, making sure you're validating your input to avoid people being able to use overflow as an attack. Issues with compiler warnings, making sure that if you compile stuff, that stuff is being verified. Um, Policies, making sure that all this stuff is defined and adhered to, and as well as your QA testing. So this is testing becomes a big factor in ensuring security. Simplicity in design, least principles of what we call least privilege. So the idea is that you design things to operate with the lowest possible privilege, as opposed to the highest level privilege. Because if you have something with high level privilege and it gets exploited, then you've got a serious situation. So as I said, a number of different things we hear. Depth, defense in depth. Fail secure is another um, approach where basically if something happens, um, it will fail. So somebody, like the example we use here for fail secure would be if somebody is attempting multiple login attempts against an account. What you do is you will you program it so after so many attempts, it will log out the account. So that would be an example of a fail secure of a situation. Isolation, one of the big features in a design is making sure that you isolate systems in such a fashion so if you compromise one level, you don't compromise everything. So public systems. So if you have like a stuff that's facing on the internet, it can be accessed from the internet. All that stuff is isolated in its own environment, own network environment, uh, with minimal, looking to harden devices and making sure you minimize the risk of tampering and leaks. Um, General systems are under isolated from each other, such a fashion so that if one thing is compromised, you don't automatically have the ability to compromise everything else. And then security mechanisms are making sure that the security systems themselves cannot be compromised, because obviously if you compromise the security systems, then you've opened the door for a whole bunch of stuff. So we talk around different techniques. Encapsulation is a technique around that. Layering is another. We talk around defensive depth. you know, using overlapping different types of security approaches, modularity in a similar fashion, open design, the idea of, you know, constantly reviewing and, getting multiple eyes to look at stuff and looking for different ways things can be compromised, and then testing, and then, whenever you identify something, to correct it. And that is everything you need to know about application software development security.